Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the program. And thank you for joining us for this week's episode in the Trent Talk series, Unmasking Racism, Part 2. I'm Stephen Stone, Trent University Chancellor and proud alumnus. And today we are joined by Trent University faculty members, Dr. Janet Miron, Director of the Frost Center for Canadian Studies and Indigenous Studies, and Dr. Don Lavell-Harvard, Director of the First Peoples House of Learning. Dr. Miron is also an associate professor in the history department, and her research and interests include the history of suicide in English-speaking Canada, medical and criminal history, and Canadian colonialism and Indigenous settler relations. Dr. Lavell-Harvard leads support for Indigenous students at Trent and serves as the president of the Ontario Native Women's Association. She is a recipient of the Governor-General's Sovereign's Medal for Volunteers, recognizing her work to break the cycle of poverty for Indigenous women and their families by providing them with culturally appropriate educational reforms and support mechanisms. Before we begin our discussion today, we would like to first respectfully acknowledge that Trent University is located on the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. We offer our gratitude to the First Peoples for their care for and teachings about our earth and our relations. May we honor those teachings. On last week's episode, we shared an important discussion with Dr. Fearing and Professor Taylor about anti-Black racism in its many forms, including here in Canada. In this week's episode, we'll continue the discussion about unmasking racism in Canada and make space to discuss racism towards Indigenous people. Janet and Don have asked to return to our question and answer format this week, as they felt it was a good way to help structure this important discussion. So with that, I will be asking questions shared by our viewers. Janet and Don, I want to say Chi-miigwech for sharing your time with us today, and in particular for the extra emotional labor involved in discussing and teaching about racism. To begin, I offer you both the floor to introduce yourselves per traditional protocol and add any background information for context. And Don, maybe we could start with you.
Chi-miigwech. Ani bojo sego segoli skanagoa wabnimi dijnakas wikwem kong donjaba. I wanted to share with you greetings and to say hello in our traditional language and in so many Indigenous languages, just to acknowledge that tradition of our country. And I introduced my traditional name, which is Wabmimi, which means white dove in our language. And I'm from the Wikwemikong First Nation on Manitoulin Island. So I too am a guest as an Odawa from Manitoulin. I'm also a guest here in the traditional territory of the Mississauga peoples on which Trent is located. I'm very honored to have the privilege of being able to live and work in the Mississauga territory. Chi-miigwech.
And Janet?
Thank you so much, Chi-miigwech, for inviting me to this discussion. It's an honor to be here with you, Stephen, and with you, Don. My name is Janet Miron Nidishikas, and I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe as well. I'm not from this territory, and I am an uninvited guest here. I am of Indigenous and European descent, Métis and Anishinaabe from Robinson Treaty Territory, and Irish, French, and English. With every step I take on these lands, I walk with deep respect for the original people who have lived here since the beginning of time and who will continue to for generations ahead. Just to provide some context about myself for this discussion, I wish to acknowledge that I have never experienced racism nor the violence of colonialism, although my recent ancestors did, who were pushed off their territories around Sault Ste. Marie and Garden River in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So my comments thus are profoundly limited and far inferior to the insights that would be provided by someone who had lived experience. So as one absolutely critical step forward, I wish to press the need for the hiring of Indigenous people as well as Black, racialized, non-cisgendered, and other oppressive groups, both at Trent and outside of Trent. Chi-miigwech, thank you.
Well, and thank you so much for that context. And let's just dig right in. here is the first of our audience submitted questions, and maybe Janet will go to you first, or maybe Don. I'll leave it to you. We talked a bit about this last week, but even this week, one of the RCMP leaders was having difficulty with this question. So can you explain, what is systemic racism, and do we have it in Canada?
So it's interesting because a lot of people think that systemic racism means that within a particular institution that everyone is racist. And I know that's the definition that a lot of the police commissioners have been talking about lately. But unfortunately, that's a really simplistic and in fact wrong conclusion. The real understanding of systemic racism is that it's when the entire system is designed in such a way to oppress, to exploit, to abuse particular groups. When we look at Canada, for example, the fact that this entire nation is founded upon the dehumanization of Indigenous peoples, those original peoples of this land, everything from the RCMP that were created to control Indigenous people, to keep them away from white populations, to remove Indigenous children from their homes, to residential schools that were designed to try to eliminate Indigenous identity and culture, to legislation. At every step within the public institutions and the structure of the Canadian society are rules, institutions, policies, and structures that are designed to work against the survival of Indigenous people. That's what systemic racism is all about. It's not about your neighbor who comes out and says, oh, you're a dirty Indian, or the odd teacher. I mean, this was something that my daughter, in fact, experienced recently with her teacher in a religion class when they were talking on Orange Shirt Day about the nuns. And the teacher was upset that she felt Orange Shirt Day portrayed nuns in a very unfair light. And she said that, I have lots of nuns who were my aunties and they were very good people. And that's very true. I mean, my daughter responded that, well, I have grandparents and parents who were in the residential schools and they were really good people too, but that didn't stop them from being abused. And so when we look at this isn't about individual players. This is about a residential school that was designed that whether those nuns were good people or not, the policy was that children were beaten if they spoke their traditional language. They were put, electroshock therapy, medical experiments, all of these kinds of things can create, it's a system. It's not an individual player. And no, there may be very good individuals. There may be some real bad apples too. We've heard lots of horrific stories, but it's about the system. I don't know, Janet, is your experience or understanding the same?
I completely support your comments, Dawn. We can see systemic racism both in Canada's history and in the present time. And it is the basis upon which Canada, as a colonial state, was founded, and it continues to rest upon that foundation. Racism in Canada is both overt and covert. It's implicit and it's explicit in our public institutions, in the police, in access to education, in access to healthcare, in opportunities that are available to children and youth. There are so many examples of systemic racism, including access to clean water. In Ontario alone, I believe we have just under 60 communities that have been under a boil water advisory for years, for decades. And that is another example of systemic oppression that inflicts marginalization, suffering, and trauma on communities, on the Indigenous peoples who have lived here since the beginning of time. We have governments that have consistently underfunded healthcare for children. And Canada's own courts, the Human Rights Tribunal, recognizes this and has ruled that Canada discriminates against Indigenous children and youths by not funding them on an equal level to their non-Indigenous counterparts. That's a horrific example and an intolerable example of systemic racism. The Indian Act as well is another example of a form of systemic racism introduced in 1876 under John A. Macdonald. it defined at the time until the 1950s status Indians as wards of the state, as children, without equal rights to non-Indigenous people. It criminalized cultural practices. It forbade freedom of movement. It forbade status Indians from becoming a lawyer. And this form of systemic racism embedded in the Indian Act imposed on sovereign peoples without their consent continues. It's still the government of Canada that defines who is a status Indian. So we can see so many examples of systemic racism, whether it's the violence in the police and the assaults and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples, the surveillance of Indigenous peoples. There are rampant examples of systemic racism in Canada.
Mm-hmm. I just want to pick up on one thing that Janet said, because I think this is something that the larger Canadian society really has no idea that is going on. And it's really hard to understand that in Canada, the education dollars that are provided per child, Indigenous First Nations children living on reserve receive, in some cases, half of what non-Indigenous children would receive within their province. Some cases, it's a little higher than half. But this is a very concrete example of the way in which the federal funding, the way in which the government is systemically denying education to Indigenous children, to First Nations children. And then we can see the outcomes of that. Our students have a much lower graduation rate, much higher challenges in the classroom in terms of, learning exceptionalities. And so you see a population that, because of historic abuse, has the greatest educational need, but is being provided with half of the resources. And then as a society, we're judged when our children do not do as well. And they say, First Nations families just don't value education, or maybe they're just not as smart, or, they don't try as hard. But they're not seeing, because this is hidden, most people don't realize that our systems, our schools, our children receive half of the resources. And that's still carrying on. That was the fundamental premise. Similarly, when you look at Cindy Blackstock's case that Janet was mentioning with regard to the First Nations child welfare systems, that our child welfare systems are systematically underfunded. They receive much less than the non-Indigenous child welfare systems. And then everybody wonders why they can't keep up, why they don't have the capacity to do as good a job, but it's built into the system. And that's why it's called systemic racism, because it creates an entire system where our people are disadvantaged, where our kids don't have the same opportunities, and then we're blamed when we don't achieve at the same level.
Well, in light of all that, and Janet, maybe I'll turn to you. Why do you think it is that some non-Indigenous people resist or refuse to acknowledge racism towards Indigenous people in Canada?
Thank you for the question. I think that if we look at the ways in which mainstream Canadian history has been written, it reveals a great deal of insight into why racism is not acknowledged and often denied today. Canada's mainstream historical narrative presents a very constructed view of the past and has erased conflicts, violence, and genocide. So when people grow up with these mythologies, thinking that Canada evolved peacefully, that there was no dislocation of people, there was no conflict, there was no violence that characterizes some other countries, especially to the south of us, people find that very comforting because it reinforces their view of what Canada is, that it's committed to human rights, that it is a peaceable country, that it was founded on peace, order, and good government according to the Constitution of 1867. And our history has really erased all of the problematic, quote, problematic elements that really lay at the foundation of the project of Canada. The removal of people from lands, often by force, often by gunpoint, often through starvation policies. They're not comfortable with that because it threatens their view of what Canada is. So denying racism today is part of that mythologizing effort to justify the status quo and to evade confronting deeply problematic issues of violence, marginalization, discrimination, racism, and oppression. So I think that, part of the colonial project has been a sanitization of the past, and that persists into the present. So while we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission with pages and pages, copious amounts of evidence of genocide and violence inflicted on children, families, communities, nations, while we have the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report with all of the evidence and testimony and copious amounts of evidence, people still deny that racism is systemic because it threatens what they have grown up believing in. But, I think that if people want to seek justice, if people want to live in an area where they are proud to be, if they want to have a government that is those things that they hold so close to their heart, they need to confront this history and this past, and they need to commit to not tolerating racism and discrimination. I think that when we hear, prime ministers denying the history of Canada's colonialism, when we hear journalists like Rex Murphy deny the existence of systemic racism, some people can claim, well, that reinforces what I was taught to believe growing up, because there's a willful act of ignorance. There's a willful act of ignoring the evidence that lies before you. But that's something that has to be addressed. We can't live in a state of ignorance. We can't live in a state where discriminating against children is tolerated. So I think that for myself, I often recall the words of Art Manuel, who in his important work, Unsettling Canada, he states to white Canadians and non-Indigenous Canadians, non-Indigenous people, he states that do not be afraid of justice. There is nothing to be afraid of when the journey is for justice.
Maybe moving a bit towards a more positive direction, with the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report and findings, a lot of people are talking about and wanting to get involved in reconciliation. So is real reconciliation possible? And is there ever a point where we can let go of the past and, quote, just get over it?
That's a comment I have heard so many times. And it relates back to, what Janet was saying about this Canadian narrative that we have of who we are as Canadian people, that this is a meritocracy. Canada's a land of opportunity, that anybody who wants to work hard, put in the effort, can go to school because we have public education, they can get ahead and they can have wealth. Because the flip side of that is, if I have wealth and I have a nice home and I have a good job and a decent car, I've earned that because, we don't have a caste system. We don't have royalty in this country. Everybody has the chance. So if I have good things, it's because I've earned them. But what those beliefs deny is, yes, if you work hard, you can achieve. But because the start point is very different for certain populations in Canada, if you come from a community that has no clean water, no hydro, no schools that have no libraries, no books, no internet, no supplies, no textbooks, then you're not starting at the same start point. So yes, you have worked hard for your job and your lovely home, but yes, our people work hard too. And in fact, in many cases, they've had to work 10 times as hard to get half as far because of that historic discrimination and racism and those policies. So when we look at, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission comes out and everybody wants to, and rightly so, everybody wants to be part of reconciliation. Everybody wants to be part of making this better. But there's a lot less interest in looking at that truth aspect. And that's the challenge, is that truth and reconciliation can't be separated. We can't have reconciliation without first having that truth telling of the real history, of the real ugly history that shows how First Nations children were sold by the Canadian government to the US like so much cattle, how Indigenous women were sterilized without consent, how the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, story after story of horrific accounting of abuse. And we don't want to get stuck in that, but it's important that we know it and we understand that as the basis for understanding how we can move forward. And I always thought it was interesting that, there's a real importance of understanding that truth, that it's the same foundation as Remembrance Day. When we're out there in November and it's cold and we see some of these war veterans, I used to look at them shaking in their little uniforms, these old guys in their 90s. And we're all talking about lest we forget, the importance of remembering that history. And it was a horrific history that we're remembering on those days. But nobody would dream of walking up to one of those veterans and saying, you need to get over it. The war was a long time ago. Because we acknowledge and understand how those tragedies fundamentally shaped the lives of millions of people, not just the people not just the young men who gave their lives, not just the young men who were serving overseas, but entire nations that were growing at that time changed because of that. And they recognize the importance of remembering so that we don't repeat it, but also so that we understand how we got to where we are today. And that, I believe, reconciliation is possible, but only if we truly take that time to step back, understand that history, open our eyes, stop denying it, recognizing at the same time, whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, we're not responsible for what came before us. We can't change what happened 2 years ago. I would love to, but it's not possible. The only thing we're responsible for is what we do now moving forward with that knowledge, what we do now moving forward with our privilege. If we're in an educational institute and you're a teacher, where is your role? And that was the beauty of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. All those calls to action showed specifically, this is what a social worker can do. This is what a teacher can do. In your classroom, talk about residential schools. Honor Orange Shirt Day. Take all those steps to start telling that truth. And that's how we can move forward together in a better way, by understanding how we got to where we are today and what we need to correct to move forward in a good way.
Now, this is a question from the audience, but I'm going to ask it as if it comes from me because it resonates with me. Now that more people are beginning to see and acknowledge the racism in Canada, what can I, as a non-Indigenous person, do to be an ally and to work against racism in general, but also against anti-Indigenous racism in Canada specifically? In other words, as a non-Indigenous person, what is my role in the struggle to end racism?
I'm really glad that Don mentioned the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Because if you're looking for a starting point to be an ally, to educate yourself, to try to implement actions in your own life on a daily basis, the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is an excellent starting point. In addition to the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which discusses Canada's history, which discusses not only residential schools, but the broader web of colonialism, of which they were just one element. So the Truth and Reconciliation is an incredible resource for non-Indigenous people seeking to be better allies, seeking to implement action in their own lives to lead to change and a more just Canada. It's available online. In addition to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and reading the calls to action in it, there are so many other things that one can do to be a better ally. As Don mentioned, use your privilege to advocate for marginalized groups. Give power to those who lack it. Acknowledge your personal responsibility in perpetuating systemic racism, and realize that that may be a very uncomfortable and very unsettling process, as it should be. And it does not compare in any way to the trauma and suffering and racism that Indigenous peoples face in Canada. So it's a journey. It's a journey to be an ally. It's a journey to seek a more just society in which inequality, discrimination, and violence is not tolerated. It is a journey, and it's a commitment that one can make in your daily life and in a broader context as well. You know, there are many ways that you can educate yourself. There's an explosion of literature by Indigenous peoples available now, from novels, poetry, blogs. You know, listen to the podcasts of Pam Pomater. Look at the work of Cindy Blackstock. You know, there's so much that's available to educate oneself about Indigenous peoples, their history before the arrival of Europeans as well, their resistance, survival, strength, resurgence, and about the trauma that has been inflicted on them, both historically and in the present day. So I strongly, you know, as a historian, I know I'm a little biased, but, you know, there's a basic level of responsibility to think critically about the dominant narrative of Canadian history, to understand why poverty exists in many reserves and how that was created by the Canadian government deliberately, in the hopes that Indigenous peoples would assimilate and disappear. So many of the problems facing communities today are the result of historic and ongoing policies. For example, according to the Indian Act, Status Indians could not sell produce, agricultural produce, on the market without permission from the government to do so. They couldn't move freely from their reserves. They couldn't go to university to become a lawyer. They couldn't hire a lawyer. Some communities were forbidden from building docks out of concern that they would be a threat to non-Indigenous communities in the fishing industry. So we have to understand this history in order to understand why conditions are the way they are today, and to move beyond those. You know, Indigenous communities have been seeking to break the cycle of poverty, but they're often trapped because of government policy. So we have a fundamental obligation to understand this history so that we can change the present and the path forward.
Exactly. So I want to jump in, Janet, and just say that, you know, once you've educated yourself and understand that history, like from the historical perspective, that is critical first step. But once you've done that, then what does that mean in an actual boots on the ground, day-to-day life of average Canadian citizens? What do they do with that understanding? And as Janet mentioned, you know, the Indigenous voice has been silenced from all of the conversations across Canada, whether it be from the local school parent council to the federal government. Those Indigenous voices have deliberately and consistently been silenced. So now the challenge is, how do we not speak on behalf of Indigenous peoples, how do we create space for Indigenous peoples to speak for themselves and come up with their own solutions? And that's where, you look at your own life and figure out, what table am I sitting at? Like I said, even if it's your local church group, if it's the school council, how do I make sure that the Indigenous voice is heard at that table? How do I take a step back and say, we need a seat here for Indigenous parents. We need a seat on the Peterborough Council for Indigenous perspectives and liaison. We need, more MPs. We need all of those tables, and to start creating space. And I mean, it's something that we've said, very often, you need to deliberately create that space because we're at this particular point in history in order to get the voices at the table. And sometimes people will say, well, we tried that 10 years ago and it didn't work. Too bad. Keep trying until you succeed. And, keep trying, because of that history of being denied those seats. Yeah, it might take a while to get some Indigenous voices. I mean, whether it be the Peterborough Kawartha Economic Development, if you're a board member sitting there, speak up and say, hey, where's our Indigenous rep at this table? And that's how we create, at every conversation we're having, asking ourselves, where's the Indigenous voice in this conversation? On a very grassroots, real, every day-to-day conversation. That's how we start changing it. And that's how we start looking at, what is the Indigenous perspective on this particular conversation? Because it's those conversations, everything from church groups to municipal, federal, provincial governments, that's where the decisions are being made about how we're going to live as Canadian peoples, about what's going to happen that's going to impact the life choices of our future generations of children, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And we need to make sure that we're part of that conversation. And that's where, again, that non-Indigenous society can make space for Indigenous voice, make space for Indigenous success and advancement and partnership. I mean, very real procurement conversations, support an Indigenous business. Recognize that, that's an important way of helping communities move forward and build their own capacity to support our own people in our own communities.
Well, and you both talked very powerfully about the journey that we are on and need to be on, and raising Indigenous voices. And of course, now voices are being raised. There's global protesting and a lot of attention being paid to Black Lives Matter. What are the connections between fighting racism against Indigenous peoples in Canada and the Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, this is a really complex conversation because I know, some people have said that we have to be very careful not to be seen to sort of be co-opting or just jumping on the bandwagon and saying that, yes, Indigenous people suffer racism too, and, not be comparing the kind of racism we experience with the kind of racism that other communities experience. But the flip side of that is also that if we are not adding our voices to that cry, if we are not part of the solution, if we are not part of the protest, then we are part of the problem. Because silence is complicity in these kind of situations. Silence is saying, if I'm not standing up and speaking out against racism, then I'm allowing it to happen. And I'm, as Janet mentioned earlier, I am being deliberately ignorant in a I'm going to ignore it kind of way. And because I don't want to know about it, I don't want to learn about it, which translates to I don't want to be part of changing it. So for Indigenous communities, we recognize and we join that call because we understand that kind of systemic abuse at the hands of police. We think about, we go out and we see the RCMP on their beautiful horses doing their musical rides, and it's a beautiful image. But what that hides is the very racist foundation of the RCMP, which is that they were created essentially to control Indigenous peoples. Back at a time where, to protect non-Indigenous peoples from First Nations peoples. And, this throughout history, the RCMP has been used to oppress Indigenous peoples, whether it was, coming into our homes to literally rip Indigenous children out of the arms of their mothers to take them away to residential schools, to, if you have that kind of history, that kind of foundation that the RCMP was created for, of course you have systemic problems within policing in relationship with Indigenous communities. We experience, I mean, it's been in the news just recently, the, Indigenous chief who had an expired license plate sticker and gets the flying tackle and then the punch in the face as he's on the ground. I mean, so we've experienced that same kind of brutal oppression and abuse at the hands of police. And we've seen, what they call the Starlight Tours are something that's a problem for Indigenous people in Canada, where police, as a way of teaching a lesson, and it very often happens to Indigenous youth, taking them out beyond the city limits. And if you're, outside of Kenora or outside of Thunder Bay, and you take a young person and you drop them off on the side of the road at -20 with no coat or no shoes, and we've seen these young people who then, that is a very real death sentence. That, the potential for them to literally freeze to death on the side of the road because some cops were going to teach them a lesson and drop them off. And this wasn't just a one-time thing. This, has literally common enough that it has a name for the phenomena and, the Starlight Tours. So that kind of brutality against our people, the families of the missing and murdered, family after family talking about going to the police to report their loved one missing and being told, well, that's just one less welfare check coming out of my taxes. That's just one less prostitute on my beat. That's just one less drug addict we have to worry about. I mean, those kind of responses consistently show the impact of racism within our institutions that needs to be exposed so we can change it. And that's why I am a little bit hopeful after the TRC, after the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry. Everybody asks, what was the greatest impact? And for me, the greatest impact is that now we can't unknow that. Now that we have seen the tragic murder that has incited all of these global protests of a Black man being held down until he can't breathe. We can't unknow that. We can't unsee that. And so now we have to move forward because it's been exposed. The beauty of hundreds of years before was that was hidden, and it allowed people to pretend it wasn't happening. And so now we can't pretend anymore. Now we have to either say, I'm either going to support this or I'm going to work to end it. And that's the question facing everybody right now. And that's why when we talk about it, we're not co-opting the debate. We're adding our voices because we have experienced similar cases of brutality based on race. We've seen it. That First Nations chief who was brutalized and, with his face beaten in, it's only because he was a chief that people are speaking about it now. If he had been some 18-year-old, some 20-year-old who'd maybe had a little bit of trouble with the law before, nobody would even be talking about the fact that he got brutalized in that way. And, the prevalence of video cameras, everybody's cell phone, these things are being exposed. We're really shining a light on the day-to-day brutality against certain bodies, certain peoples. And we have to address it. It has to be exposed. And we have to add our voices to that call because it's, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And if we allow it to happen to one group, then you're opening up the potential of oppressing any group. And so whether you are from an ethnic minority, whether you're, we've seen cases around the world where this isn't even necessarily a black and white thing. We have to name it, we have to see it, we have to understand why certain populations are targeted in certain countries based on that colonial history, based on racism, based on skin color, based on religious, based on gender or sexual orientation. Everybody needs to be standing up and calling it out and exposing it so that we can start that process of changing it. Because as I've said, silence is part of the problem. Silence is allowing something to continue. And if you are not part of the solution, then you are in fact part of the problem and you are contributing to it.
You've been talking about history and not unknowing things. And actually, maybe Janet, as you're the historian, I'll address this question to you. Because I think it relates, at least in a small way, towards exactly this. We have seen the removal of statues in many parts of the world as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. Now in Canada, we've seen some similar moves to address racism towards Indigenous peoples and the commemoration of historical figures who perpetuated, such as the debate surrounding the renaming of buildings or schools that were named after people who were key players in a genocidal history. Could you talk about the benefits and indeed the risks of these renaming processes?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Don, so much for your comments and your sharing your insights in all of your responses. It's such an honor to be here with you. I think that, the movement that we are seeing, that in some ways crystallized around the horrific murder of George Floyd, that is also paralleled in Canada in many ways by the killing by the police of Rodney Levy and Chantal Moore just this month, two Indigenous individuals. I think that this is part of this movement to dismantle racism and oppression that is seen on the streets, that is also seen in debates about monuments, that's seen in the tossing of statues into rivers and dismantling these statues from public spaces. Often we hear from those who question the removal of statues and the renaming of buildings, of schools, and so on. But it's erasing the past, that we are erasing the past by tearing down these statues and renaming schools. But this is so very far from the truth. Those statues and those names on schools are representational of an erasure of the past. They represent the buttressing of white supremacy and colonialism and the erasure of violence, oppression, and assault upon which those systems rest. It's not about denying history. It's in fact about complicating that dominant narrative that many have been taught. For example, in Canada, we have statues of John A. Macdonald that celebrate him and hold him up as a hero. But we are erasing in those statues, we are erasing his racism and his genocidal policies. We're erasing his starvation policies that resulted in the deaths of thousands of Indigenous peoples. We're erasing his execution of Indigenous leaders who resisted Canadian colonialism, and so on. So nowhere in these statues are those very fundamental parts of history represented. So what has been erased in that statue is that fuller picture of history and the perpetuation of one specific perspective that generally represents white Canadian, upper class, cisgendered people and men. So never did these statues represent history. They represent one portrayal of history. And we see the mobilization around these statues as one expression of the refusal to tolerate racism and the violence that it inflicts anymore.
And yes, I'm aware that we're actually pushing well beyond our normal allotted time schedule for these episodes, but I'm just going to carry on anyway because this is so important, and what you're saying is so vital to Canada today. So let's just carry on. I'll ask a final audience submitted question. And Don, you earlier talked about this, I think, in a more general way, but let's be specific. What should Trent University as an institution be doing to address racism on our campus and on our communities, going beyond the rhetoric, the good words and the slogans to real action, to anti-racist practices?
Thank you, because I think this circles back to exactly what we were talking about is, instead of waiting for the government to make the grand scheme changes, what can we do as individual people in our day-to-day lives in the places that we work, such as Trent University? And again, So we start with, how do we look at applying, a Indigenous lens to a race lens, an equity lens, a gender lens to everything we do, whether it be human resources policies, whether it be, the looking at the new sign we're putting up, starting to ask ourselves those all important questions about how does this impact certain vulnerable populations? What can I do to make sure it has positive impact? How can I make sure some of those voices are heard? How can we get more Indigenous voice in these conversations? Trent has done a wonderful job of, in recent years, actively reaching out to local First Nations communities to ensure that, we're building that relationship, having regular meetings, talking with the consultation officers, creating a new Elders and Traditional Knowledge Holders Council to advise the Board of Governors and the President and the VPs of Trent University when they're doing their work, so that we're not simply, running out to the First Nation when we need to have a tick box on some land consultation. We're actually developing a relationship so that we can ensure that we're moving forward in positive ways. And that sometimes means that, we need to think about equity. And that's very different from equality. People think about equality, that ensuring everybody gets the same. But if you're not starting with the same, then giving everybody the same doesn't lead to the same outcome. So we need to think about giving, creating opportunity so everybody actually has genuine equal opportunity. And that means that because of historic inequities, we might have to invest more in groups for marginalized people, support programs, whether that be mentoring, tutoring, whether that be, like the First Peoples House of Learning, we have tutors, we have mentors, we have peer support, we have programs, lunch and learns, all of these kinds of things to help provide the foundations that other non-Indigenous students are coming to the school with, so that our students can succeed at the same level, so that they can have the same opportunity. And that's about also making sure that Trent is a welcoming space, really applying a critical lens to, that physical space, to the bodies that are represented everywhere from the staff and the administration levels to the faculty, to the VP level. How do we make sure that all of those structures reflect the diversity of our student population, which based on gender, race, indigeneity, all of those things. And sometimes that requires a very concerted effort to look for and recruit and hire people from various diverse communities. And that takes a little bit more effort. And the university needs to be willing to expend that effort. And it needs to be willing to support those candidates once they've come into the institution to succeed, not use, what we sort of call the sink or swim approach, that once you get in, just sort of cut you loose and you can, tough it out, same as everybody else had to, but really actively support so that we ensure that our Indigenous scholars, that are, women of color scholars, that are LGBTQ scholars, feel they're being actively supported through this process, because they may not be coming with the same cultural capital, the same advantages that privilege have given other populations within society, that sort of implicit unknown knowledge that other communities that have had, generations of people through the institutions that you get from your cousins, parents, grandparents, that we're not getting because we haven't been part of this institution. So how do we actively create those mentorship opportunities? How do we actively build that knowledge? And it takes time, and it takes policies, it takes critically reflecting, but it also is important to look at. I know there's been conversations, dare I bring it up, about, that the positioning of Champlain as an unquestioned hero, like what Janet was talking about, that when we hold people up as heroes in these sort of mythological formats where we're only looking at the great explorer side of that person and completely erasing the entire other side that, exploited and oppressed Indigenous populations, when we make them very one-dimensional that way, that is in fact creating an unwelcoming environment for Indigenous peoples who come in and see these, heroic people being held up in heroic ways. And this circles back to the very point of the beginning of our conversation, which is about acknowledging that uncomfortable truth. So we have to tell the whole truth about people like Champlain, not just the wonderful exploration and the bust and the portraits. We have to talk about that other ugly dark side too. And that's how we make sure that these environments are welcoming and respectful to the true history. It's about not whitewashing. You know, when we start removing the name of, the Langevin building in Ottawa, because that particular individual was, really had a key role in the residential school movement. If we simply wipe his name off the building, rename it something else, now he doesn't exist. As Canadian society, that's a really convenient way of whitewashing our history and saying all the atrocities that he committed never happened. And we can't see it now, but maybe somewhere 50 years from now or 100 years from now, nobody will remember what he did because we've erased it from our history. So how do we complicate history? How do we tell the whole truth about our history, even the ugly parts of it? You know, if you have that building, you have a statue honoring, all of the names of the thousands of Indigenous children that died because of the residential schools. At the base of the monument, you have plaques, you have teaching that talk about the starvation policies and how many thousands of Indigenous people died because of that. You tell the whole truth when you're holding somebody up in that way, because we need that whole truth if we're going to create a fair and just society, if we're going to be the Canada that we think we are. The nice, can I sneak past you? Because we're super polite as Canadians and we don't commit atrocities. We need to kind of look at the atrocities that happened, understand them, but stop them. It's my grandmother used to say when the kids would be fighting and, my brother would say, I'm sorry for kicking my brother. And after the third or fourth time, my grandmother would say, it's not enough to say you're sorry and then you go kick him again. You have to stop kicking him if your apology means anything. And as a society, we have to stop kicking certain populations. When we stand up and say we're sorry, we have to stop the abuse, the oppression, the exploitation. And that's how we're going to really change things. And I do believe it's possible. People might think I'm a little too Pollyanna, but I really think that I have seen, even in my space within university, from, when I started, I had a faculty supervisor who looked me in the eye my first day and said, what are you doing here? You people belong at OISE. To the work we're doing now in the First Peoples House of Learning for Indigenous students, that, you're not just one of two PhDs in the entire university. We're actively creating a PhD in Indigenous studies where Indigenous students from first year to PhD are supported. They have somewhere they can go. They have mentors. They have even just somewhere they can go when they have a complaint, that they can feel safe raising their voice and speaking up for themselves. That's a huge achievement and a huge opportunity for those next generations to, when Janet said we have to empower, but people don't really often understand, what does that mean? I can't just give somebody else power, but you can create safety structures so that young Indigenous people have a safe space to just be within the institution, safe opportunities so they can speak out and exercise their voice in a safe way without fear of retribution. If I speak out against my professor, am I going to get a 0? How do we create those safety structures to make this environment safe for Indigenous people to release their power? They have that power within them. We just need to make sure we stop cutting it down. We need to give them an opportunity to really speak out and not have a fear of retribution. So I think Trent has actually been doing a great job. There's still a lot of work to do, don't get me wrong. And we are taking those baby steps. Sometimes when there's still so much work left to do, we begin to feel depressed. We begin to feel like, we're never going to be able to change this. And that's when it's important to stop and take a look back and see how far we've come and the advancements we've made. From a time frame when there was only 200 people across all of Canada who had post-secondary education to, we got more than that at Trent right now. Look at the difference we have made, but we can't become complacent. We can't sort of say, yeah, we've already done enough. We have to keep fighting that good fight. We have to keep having those difficult conversations if we're going to continue to move forward till we get to a place of actual equity and equitable opportunity for anybody in this country, regardless of color, regardless of gender, regardless of sexual orientation, regardless of all of those identities that we share within our bodies. And they're not simple. Those things, even race and gender, those all mix in beautiful, wonderful ways in all kinds of identities.
we're coming to the end of our discussion today here on Trent Talks, but hopefully just the beginning or the launching of ongoing discussion and action within the Trent community and beyond. Before we wrap up, can I ask you, you've got any sort of final summation or words to carry us towards better tomorrow? Janet?
I just wanted to support what Dawn expressed about, building safe spaces and ensuring Indigenous people at Trent, for example, Indigenous students succeed and thrive. And, we all have a role to play in not simply building safe spaces, but accountable spaces where we're constantly checking our privilege, constantly, questioning our actions and opening up space for Indigenous voices, advocating for Indigenous voices at every table. So like Dawn, I do feel very hopeful about the future. There has been incredible change that's taken place. And I believe that this is a journey that we are all on together and one we can all thrive on.
And Dawn, is there a final word, or you pretty much summed it up in your last minute?
But I think I wanted to honor Janet and say how for our young students who are coming into the institution, and maybe some not so young, but having people like Janet, having Indigenous scholars at the head of those classrooms, having Indigenous scholars on the walls of this institution is really key. We can sit there and say, you can be anything you want to be, live your dreams. But if they don't actually see it as a possibility, because they don't see those bodies, those actual strong Indigenous women standing at the front of the room, then it doesn't really ring true. It sounds like just so much bullshit that we're feeding them. They need to see scholars like Janet standing at the front of the classroom. We need to get more of them. But having those people leading, show our young people the potential of what you can be, and also create a safe space and a safe person within the institution that they can identify with, that they can come to, that they can work with. That's huge. That's key. And we need more.
Janet and Dawn, that was so important. Chima Gwetch, again, both of you. And for everyone at home, thank you for joining us today and continuing our journey of learning and unlearning together. We hope you'll tune in again next week for Business Recovery in the Pandemic with faculty from Trent School of Business, Dr. Azaz Zohar and Dr. Ray Dark. In the meantime, we do want to hear your thoughts about today's conversation, as well as your questions for next week's episode. As always, you can continue the learning and the unlearning and the discussion on social using the hashtag TrentTalks. Until next week, stay safe, and please always remember, you are not alone. Goodbye for now.